minute. Good evening, and welcome to the Cherokee Garden Library talk, Olmsted and Yosemite, Civil War, Abolition, and the National Park Idea with Rolf Diamant. My name is Melissa Wright, and I am the chair of the Cherokee Garden Library Advisory Board here at the Atlanta History Center, and I'm delighted that we are all here together tonight. This year marks the 200th anniversary of the birth of Frederick Law Olmsted, social reformer and founder of American landscape architecture. As part of the Olmsted 200 National Celebration, the Atlanta History Center is pleased to join the National Association for Olmsted Parks, the Garden Club of America, the Olmsted Linear Park Alliance, partners, friends, and the public in this effort to explore Olmsted's living legacy. Please mark your calendars for Tuesday, May 3rd at 10 a.m. as we continue celebrating Olmsted 200 with a Cherokee Garden Library talk featuring Jennifer Richardson and Spencer Tennell. They will discuss their book, Olmsted's Linear Park, about the last residential suburb designed by Olmsted, Druid Hills, right here in Atlanta. I wish to share a little background for those joining us for the first time. The Cherokee Garden Library was established by the Cherokee Garden Club of Atlanta in 1975 and is named for the Cherokee Road floral emblem of Georgia. The library is one of the special collection libraries of the Keenan Research Center at the Atlanta History Center. The library collects and preserves books, periodicals, manuscript collections, and visual arts collections ranging from 1586 to the present. These collections tell the diverse and fascinating stories of horticulture and botanical history in the southeastern United States and areas of influence throughout the world. The Cherokee Garden Library is deeply connected to the Atlanta History Center's Gazweta Gardens, a remarkable 33-acre green space that contains 9 distinct ecologically beneficial and educational gardens. I invite you to learn more about these gems of the Atlanta History Center, whether you visited here dozens of times or it's your first visit, as they are always new treasures to explore. I want to say a tremendous thank you to our sponsors for this evening, Arbor Medics, Alex Smith Garden Design Limited, RBC Wealth Management, Revival Construction, Architecture and Landscapes. Thank you also to our generous patrons this evening. You can find their names on the display boards in the atrium members, in the Draper's Members Room. A gracious thanks to our event co-chairs, Maybe Hollis and Tavia McEwen, along with our floral designers, Ann Dupree, Fluffy McDuffie, Ann Morey, and Isabel Pope. I also extend my gratitude to each of you for attending this special evening tonight. I would now like to welcome Stacy Catron, Cherokee Garden Library Director, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Melissa. Gosh, it is so good to see all of y'all. I think I haven't hugged so many necks, well, in 2.5 years. And I'm going to hug more of y'all after, so just be prepared. The hugging is coming. So before I introduce Rolf, I want to let you know at the end of his presentation, we are going to have Q&A, and my colleague Jen is going to bring a microphone around to anybody who raises their hands and has a question for Rolf. And I also want to encourage all of y'all to participate more in Olmsted 200. You can visit olmsted200.org after tonight's event and take advantage of all the engaging programs in Atlanta. The Olmsted Linear Park Alliance has some fantastic programs coming up this month. And the University of Georgia also has some great programs going on this month. So please support them. And if you happen to be in Chicago soon, you can also go to the big event there. I might get on a plane because I'm pretty excited about it. So it is now my honor to introduce our speaker this evening. Last summer, when I learned about the Olmsted 200 celebration, I rushed to call my friend Lucy Lawless, who was going to be here this evening, but her flight got canceled due to weather. And I called Lucy, she's a mentor, and I said, Lucy, give me the best suggestion. Who do we need to bring from Olmsted 200 to the Cherokee Garden Library? And she immediately said, oh, Rolf and Ethan have a new book coming out, Olmsted and Yosemite. And I was like, So I think the next day I emailed Rolf, and he graciously accepted. And so I'm so grateful to Lucy and so grateful that he accepted. So a little bit about Rolf. Rolf Diamant is an adjunct associate professor in the University of Vermont's Historic Preservation Program, a landscape architect and historian. He was a Beatrix Farron Fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. That just did y'all see the stars in the air? And a Loeb Fellow in Advanced Environmental Studies at Harvard University. More stars in the air. In his previous career with the National Park Service, Rolf was a planner, resource manager, and park superintendent. And this is my favorite part that I read about him online, which I've written up here. A believer in expanding the national park system in new directions. Rolf worked on developing a variety of new areas, including urban national parks, national heritage areas, and partnership-based wild and scenic rivers during his time there, which I'm very impressed by. As superintendent of the Frederick National Historic Site, Rolf organized a multi-year initiative to conserve and open up the Olmsted archives and was deeply involved with the launch of the Olmsted Center for Landscape Preservation. Y'all know I'm an archivist at heart. That just makes me so happy. He currently writes about the history of national parks and their impact on American society. He is co-editor and contributing author, along with his wife, Nora Mitchell, of A Thinking Person's Guide to America's National Parks, which they graciously signed for the library earlier today. His column on the complexities and challenges associated with national parks regularly appears in the University of California's journal's Park Stewardship Forum. And I have 4 more paragraphs, but that's enough. Because he's very impressive. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Rolf Diamant to the stage.
Now, that was an introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank the Cherokee Garden Library and the Atlanta History Center in particular. I have to say that its library director, Stacy, has been so warm and so gracious and so welcoming. Very special person, so you're very lucky to work with her. Nora and I would also like to, for just to take a second, to thank our intrepid guides for the last few days, who led us through a veritable tempest. But we got to see places we would not have missed for the world. Maybe Hollis, Laura Draper, Sandra Kruger, Spencer Tonnell, Tavia McCune, Melissa Wright, Richard Harker, and Michael Rose. Thank you, one and all. Frederick Law Olmsted was a big advocate for parks, libraries, public spaces, particularly museums. So I think if Olmsted could see what you all have done here in Atlanta, if he could return, he would be incredibly impressed. Now, for tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about our new book, Olmsted in Yosemite. It's largely a timely reinterpretation of the origins of our national parks. So where did the idea even come from to create a system of national parks? Did it arise spontaneously from a campfire conversation on the Yellowstone Plateau in 1870? That was the official story for many years, since proved largely, alas, untrue. Did it have something to do with Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir, who had their picture taken standing on Glacier Point in Yosemite? 2 animated talkers themselves, but they shared if you've seen the Ken Burns series, any of you have seen that on public television, they shared a campfire together in 1903, but I'll say more about that story a little later on. And why are we even talking this evening about Frederick Law Olmsted? He was a city park designer, right? What does he have to do with national parks? To start with, I have a confession that I think in our title of our book, when we talk about the national park idea, what we're really talking about, to be honest, is the public park idea. Particularly as it took shape in the mid-19th century, before and during the United States Civil War. Certainly the most traumatic and transformative years in our nation's history. Indeed, it was the broader concept of the public park that was the source of the national park idea, even if we choose to consider them separate at all. And it was during this extremely tumultuous period that the whole idea of the public park, both in the nation's largest city, New York, and in the remote Sierra Nevada of California, became established as a new institution in a remade American republic. So the goal with this book was to put Yosemite Valley in the historical context of the great issues of the day: the Civil War, abolition, Reconstruction. And by doing that, answer involvement with Yosemite Valley and the origins of the public park, and consequently the national park idea. Now, Frederick Law Olmsted is best known as a landscape architect and the co-designer of Central Park. And most people, when you hear Olmsted, that's what they think of. But he was also a very well-traveled chronicler of the antebellum Southern society. He traveled throughout the South and would serve the Union during the Civil War as executive director of something called the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which provided medical relief to Union soldiers. But in 1865, towards the end of the war, he wrote a report intended to guide the future management of Yosemite National Park in California. Now, that seems to be a pretty wide stretch, so I'm going to explain that a little bit. But we are often inclined, when we look at people like Olmsted, to segment their lives into very discrete chapters. But Olmsted's life really defied that kind of precise compartmentalization. He pivoted entirely from one thing to the next. He carried over whatever he was working on into his next career, and then his life didn't evolve during these years, particularly his early career. I think it accreted. The layers just were piled up one after another on top of each other. He pivoted at one point from being an anti-slavery writer and journalist to being a park designer. Then he pivoted from being a wartime administrator to being a landscape architect. But his peripatetic activities always seemed to overlap with one another. During the war years, and this is where he became truly a polymath, to use the word, involved with administering the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which was no small undertaking. It was a huge operation, where it was said he subsisted on pickles and black coffee. He had time for nothing else. But all the while he was at the Sanitary Commission, what was he doing? He was working on New York City. And at the same time he was doing those things, he was constantly advising on war strategy for the Lincoln administration, and even drafted preliminary legislation Everything he did was guided by his consistent and unwavering commitment to social activism. his strong views on human improvement. And that was his concept. We could improve people by improving the spaces which they encountered where they lived and particularly where they recreated. And it was defined, this activism was also defined fast antagonism towards slavery. These were his guiding North Star. In dispatches back to the New York Times on his journeys through the antebellum South, he made it very clear that slavery was the greatest sin and shame upon any nation or people on God's earth. And he said it was the duty, quote, of every man in the world to oppose slavery, to weaken it, to destroy it. In his opinion, there was no greater impediment to the nation's progress. The title of Olmsted's well-known book, which we saw a first edition today, thanks to Stacy, Cotton Kingdom, was in fact a play off of the words of South Carolina Senator John Hammond, who infamously declared on the floor of the Senate that the absolute economic power of cotton would, quote, bring the whole world to our feet. That power was exercised before the Civil War when politicians in Washington blocked land grants for education, transportation, and homesteading. With a relatively weak central government with limited responsibility, basically delivering the mail, manning frontier posts, and pursuing fugitive slaves. I may have gotten ahead of myself here, so let me go one slide out of order for some reason, but we'll work with that. There was a real question at the time whether a Republican form of government, in fact, could successfully create a place like Central Park. The creation of this great Olmsted was co-designer with Calvert Vaux, in the largest city of the American Republic, was a symbolic repudiation of a weak national government constrained by slave interests. In making the case for Central Park, some years earlier, Andrew Jackson Downing rejected the cynicism of critics, both North and South, whom he denounced as having in the refinement of the Republic. Downing had anticipated, in fact, it might take till next century, till the 20th century, for a really, truly Republican spirit to take hold in America. He could not have imagined, Downing could not have imagined in the 1850s, the immediate success of Central Park once it was built, and how quickly the country would be transformed by the Civil War. Now, forgive me because I have to go back to this one slide. In August of 1861, only 4 months after the Civil War began, Olmsted received a letter from Sarah Shaw. That name may not be familiar to you, but she was a social reformer, an abolitionist, and she was the mother of Robert Gould Shaw. If any of you have ever seen the movie Glory, Robert Gould Shaw was the commander of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, and the younger Shaw, in fact, would die along with more than 100 of his black soldiers at Fort Wagner a few years later in 1863. But in her letter to Frederick Law Olmsted, Mrs. Shaw made a remarkably prescient association between emancipation, government reform, and the creation of great public parks. These are the words of Sarah Shaw. And they became, in fact, they really became the starting point for our book. She was our muse, our inspiration. And she said in her letter, if we can remake the government, abolish slavery, and get Central Park well underway for our descendants, we shall have done a work worthy of the 19th century. Shaw's letter was written when putting down the rebellion and reestablishing the Union were in fact paramount objectives for the Lincoln administration. She, however, framed the conflict as an opportunity to reinvent the nation and replace a political system that had long sanctioned slavery. In her choice of words, to remake the government, implied that her goal was not only the restoration of the old federal union as it was, but its replacement with something markedly better. Her vision was also associated with the creation of great public parks, an achievement representative of the kind of civic progress she wished, in fact, for the whole country. These accomplishments were, in fact, interdependent. And together, for Shaw, they represented her highest ambition for 19th century America. Here we go. Now, jumping ahead to the second year of the war, was becoming, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, by its second year, a remorseless and revolutionary struggle. Hundreds of thousands, however, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people self-emancipated, seeking freedom and sanctuary behind Union lines. Olmsted clearly understood, and he wrote this in 1861 in a letter to the New York Times, in a long letter, that black resistance and self-emancipation in large numbers would hollow out the Confederacy. He also testified before something called the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission at the time of his support for employing black soldiers. Inherently understanding that the return of large numbers of these formerly enslaved men as soldiers in the United States Army would present an existential threat to slavery and the life of the rebellion. Indeed, this great movement of freed people and their new alliance with the Federal Army, and by extension the national government, would place enormous pressure on the Lincoln administration to advance its plans ultimately to codify emancipation. That there would be no negotiated settlement returning the country to its pre-war status quo, rapid changes began to occur. A Republican majority in Congress in the Lincoln administration replaced laws and policies that primarily served the interests of those profiting from slavery at the time. Congress first struck down slavery in the District of Columbia, then in all the western territories of the United States, and finally in all lands occupied by Union troops. At the same time, Congress sought to build a more activist republic focused on improvements that would serve much broader constituencies. Within a period of just 5 months, from March to July of 1862, legislation passed for a national banking and revenue system, a first, a new Department of Agriculture, new land grants for public education, transportation, and homesteading. The Civil War, in Lincoln's view, was a people's contest, and the government should exist to help the people. The capstone, of course, to all this, what is referred to by historians as the Second American Revolution, was congressional authorization for recruiting black soldiers into the United States Army, followed almost immediately by Lincoln's release of his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. In June of 1864, and the war's still going on, this is just a continuation, Lincoln signs another land grant. This time granting Yosemite Valley to the state of California for use as a public park. But Olmsted made it clear. It was in trust, in his words, in trust for the whole nation. The Yosemite Act drew its inspiration from Central Park, the ability of the Republic to meet the needs of large numbers of its citizens. At the same time, when the Republican movement, in fact, the idea of republicanism was being assailed by monarchists all over Europe, and of course violently rejected by secessionists in the United States, Central Park and Yosemite represented an embodiment of the Republican idea that might bind the nation together during its greatest social and political crisis. And so when Olmsted finds but he goes to California and he takes a job at a mining Yosemite grant from the United States for the purposes of making the valley into a public park, would turn to Olmsted based on his Central Park reputation, his credentials. Because at this point, even though Central Park wasn't even completed, it was being visited by millions of New Yorkers. It was a national phenomenon. So Olmsted's reputation and also his ideas as a leading public intellectual and social theorist of his day. What Olmsted did at Yosemite has a lot to do with what, in fact, he was doing at Central Park. The two great icons of American landscape had some very important things in common that transcends their apparent, on the surface, their apparent differences. The purpose of the new park in California and the justification for the government to act in making it, as Olmsted described them, were entirely consistent what he had described in Central Park only a few years earlier. He believed that public parks, in fact, were necessary to maintain people's mental and physical health. Wealthy people could own their own country estates or could afford private resorts, but a public park should be available to all. Olmsted envisioned Yosemite Valley as a public landscape that would eventually be visited by millions of people a year. He wasn't far off. In fact, to get into Yosemite Valley today, you need a reservation. But he also warned very explicitly against unplanned use that could degrade or destroy both places that so many people would have on this landscape. And you know, this profession of landscape architecture was about finding ways to reduce or mitigate that impact. And no, this goal was not realized for all people. I mean, this has to be said. Not all people who were, certainly not those people who were displaced from their homes to make these parks. And those who perhaps found the parks too distant to reach or were discriminated against when they tried to visit. Even Olmsted, as untrammeled. Excuse me, here we go. There is no record of Olmsted's reply to Sarah Shaw when she wrote him, but they certainly shared a similar vision. In the Yosemite report that Olmsted wrote, he specifically identified continuing the work being done in Central Park, along with the construction of the Capitol Dome. There was no dome on the Capitol at that time, as well as the establishment of Yosemite Valley, as projects that affirm the efficacy of Republican government and the necessity of defending it. Now, I have to say this, I don't mean to be critical of other colleagues in the history, in the world of public history, but early historians have often been at a loss to explain the Yosemite Act, considering its wartime passage an unexplained anomaly or a great mystery. They could not comprehend how could the Congress take time out of, they're in the middle of the war, take time out to consider this land grant, small land grant in Yosemite in California. Quite to the contrary, Ethan Carr and I, my co-author, placed the Yosemite Act squarely in the larger framework of wartime legislative and constitutional reform. In fact, as Lincoln believed, if an insurrection could interfere with the functioning and continuity of constitutional government, quote, it might fairly claim to have already conquered and ruined us. These are slightly out of order, but I'll find my way with your patience. The Yosemite report, in fact, provided Olmsted share his aspirational vision for a reconstructed post-war nation, where great public parks would in fact be keystone institutions of a renewed democracy. In the report, Olmsted reaffirmed every person's entitlement to enjoy the nation's most spectacular landscapes and recognized the explicit responsibility of government to make that possible. In the process, Olmsted framed the intellectual foundation for our national parks that we enjoy today when he said, "The establishment by government of great public grounds for the free enjoyment of the people is thus justified as a political duty." Olmsted believed that government had a compelling obligation to support these great parks on an equal footing with other major responsibilities. Without the Union victory, in a country still held back by slave interests and a very small postage stamp-sized government ideology, the park in Yosemite no doubt would have shared the fate of all the other bottled up or vetoed Republican initiatives of the time. Now, throughout most of its history, the National Park Service has in fact been very reluctant, for any number of reasons, to recognize this crucial role of the Civil War and Reconstruction that both these events played in its early history of national parks, including the establishment of Yellowstone National Park in 1872. To the U.S. Constitution. However, at the turn of the century, early national park leaders and their publicists were content with inventing a national park or reimagined as national parks by early explorers or early conservationists, such as John Muir or even Teddy Roosevelt, serve very well as a more comforting and affirming narrative. Perhaps Olmsted was just too closely identified with Central Park at a time when the new national parks, in fact, were being marketed as a concept born in our rugged West, not in the urban East. Perhaps his books were too strong in condemning slavery and the Old South, quote unquote, when the Civil War was being widely reinterpreted at the turn of the century through the lens of a lost cause. Reconciliation between North and South was a national obsession, illustrated in this photograph of veterans. Here we go, let me pull. Veterans at Gettysburg shaking hands at the Peace Jubilee in 1913. And all across the nation, Jim Crow and segregation were ascendant, North and South. The film Birth of a Nation was screened in the White House in 1915, barely a year before the legislation was approved to create a professional Bureau of Parks, a National Park Service. These two gentlemen in the 1920s and 30s, when new national parks like Shenandoah and Great Smoky Mountains opened in the South, they were developed with segregated public facilities. Even the dedication event on the far right here of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington in 1922 had segregated seating for all the attendees. And those who are familiar and wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner, by such means as they will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So in conclusion, and a more inclusive history of our national parks. It is necessary to revisit our past with openness to new information, and perhaps most importantly, with the pursuit of an ever wider context that sheds new light not only on our past, but our present condition. The Yosemite Grant at the time of its enactment was a very consequential, ultimately, over time, a very consequential component of a much larger program of wartime legislative reforms that fundamentally changed the country forever. These reforms, though imperfect and incomplete, significantly broadened people's relationship to their government and raised expectations of that government's role, improving the life and expanding the rights of all American citizens. Of course, this was contested then and it is still contested today. So the 1865 Yosemite Report is still useful as a timeless appeal for equitable access to our parks and a powerful affirmation of government's immutable responsibility for park stewardship now and hopefully forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rolf. I have chill bumps. Does anybody else have chill bumps? Oh, my mind's blown. Okay. So open up the floor to questions. My colleague, Ms. Anderson, will bring you the microphone if you will raise your hand.
Testing.
Anybody has any questions? I see one there in the back. Dr. Goldfarb, I believe.
I haven't read your book, but do you tie in the establishment of the military parks in the 1890s? There were 5 of them that were established. And how does that fit in with the national parks? I know the military parks were in the Department of Defense.
The War Department, yeah.
Yeah, War Department.
The old War Department.
So can you comment on that?
Sure, I'm happy to. It's a good question. The national park system grew slowly. Its portfolio increased very gradually. Yellowstone in 1872, it wasn't really until the 1890s that the Sierra parks, Kings Canyon, the larger Yosemite Park came into the system. But there were national monuments that were created. Some were given to the National Park Service. Well, there's no National Park Service. Some were created. So this group of battlefields that were they were established as commemorative spaces and put under the jurisdiction of the War Department. They didn't become part of the national park system as we know it until 1933. There was a great reorganization of the Park Service, and all of these were by Franklin Roosevelt to the National Park Service in the 33 reorganization. But we talk about them in our book because Congress was legislating these parks in the late 19th century to celebrate the battlefield, but never talk about the larger context of the Civil War. Why it was fought, what was the outcome, what was the impact on America. It was just tactics and strategy, and that was what was interpreted, I have to say, right up until probably the National Park Service were explained, that they tried to, tell the story of the battle, but also place it in the larger framework, what was happening and why the battle was important and what changes occurred in the country as a whole as a result of the war. But yeah, we do talk a little bit about the establishment of those commemorative parks. It was the first time that the Congress actually addressed the war in terms of its memory, public memory.
Poking my head out. Do we have another question?
Mine's sort of a two-part question. A possible great lands in the country, why was it Yosemite? Why was it the first one to get this kind of attention? And the second part is, question is, as great as Ken Burns' documentary has been, was there any part of that that you would have liked to seen covered or elucidated?
Oh yeah, another talk. I know Ken Burns, so and I'm a great fan. So I have to put that in the picture here. And I think he did a remarkable job with the National Park Series. But yes, indeed, there were things I would like to have seen differently. And I'll be very frank. He took this story on national parks up until about 1980. And that series was when, 2011? He missed about 50 new national parks. I mean, the system has constantly evolved. It's constantly changed. And it's changed in new ways. Stacy referred to some of my interests in seeing the park system expand in new directions, urban parks, partnership parks, parks that tell the social history of the country. He missed a certain amount of that story by cutting it off in 1980. And the reason he cut it off in 1980, I think, was that was the year that they signed Jimmy Carter signed the Alaska Lands Act, and all those Alaskan parks came into the national park system. It doubled the size of the entire national park system. It was a heroic moment, and he likes heroic moments. It was a good ending. This history that I was talking about also is absent from the Ken Burns series. And I said I would come back, and thank you for your question, because I said I'd come back to saying a word or two about John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt. And there's a very famous picture I don't have on the screen but with me, but of them standing at Glacier Point in Yosemite. Some of you are nodding your heads. You remember it. It's a very Library of Congress picture. And it's in Ken Burns' series. In fact, he has almost a whole episode on the day Roosevelt's visit to Yosemite, and it's 1903. He somehow seeks out Muir, and they leave the Secret Service behind and go camping in the woods. And they certainly talked about a lot of things. I'm sure that, Muir talked Roosevelt's ear off, and Roosevelt talked Muir's ear off all night long. And at the time, it was very important. They were trying to get that little piece of Yosemite, which was the grant, which is Yosemite Valley, sort of the jewel in the crown, added to the larger national park that surrounded it at the time. There was a larger national park created around the California grant. So they wanted to put it all together, and that was certainly first and foremost on Muir's mind, that he was laser focused on that. But they didn't talk about, despite the fact, even the National Park Service up until a little while ago used to say that John Muir was the father of national parks. He was a great and articulate advocate, but the Yellowstone National Park was 30 years before that campfire conversation. 30 years preceded it. And the creation of the National Park Service didn't occur until 1916, so that's 13 years after the campfire confab. And for that matter, Teddy Roosevelt was inclined to put the whole, if a National Park Service was created, he was inclined to put the whole thing under the Forest Service. Gifford Pinchot was his principal conservation advisor. So That's maybe this was the second part of your question. So why Yosemite? Why not someplace else? Well, to be truthful, the logical place was, in fact, Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls was considered in the early 19th century as the premier phenomena, the most scenic place in the continental United States. But for a variety of reasons, it had been developed to a certain extent. And Yosemite was in the public domain. It was land that was in the public domain, and it was possible to take Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa River redwood trees, giant redwoods, and include them in the Yosemite Act. Also, Olmsted was, serendipitously, he was there. Who would have ever dreamt he would be about 15 miles from Yosemite Valley when the call came?
So let's see, do we have one final question? Are we set for the Rolf so much? It's just an honor to have you here. So many thanks again to our sponsors and for everyone being here tonight. Please join us for an author's book signing. You can buy Rolf's book outside. We have many good wines that I've selected, so please come talk to me if you don't care for them. And there's a lovely reception and food outside as well. And please join us and let's celebrate Olmsted 200.
Okay, I think we're set.
That was a
You
great
bet.
talk.
Oh, good.
I loved it.
Oh, wow, you're very kind.
No, you were excellent, and I'm so glad you came to speak here.